I heard Khashayar read from his debut chapbook right there, and I was enthralled by the sensitivity and the fluidity of his address. And after the reading, I was like, wow, this is good. That's what I do, right? It's like, wow, this is good. I gotta ask this individual to send his manuscript to us if he would be so inclined. So the book Khashayar provided to us built on the chapbook by expanding its range of references to a number of philosophers and filmmakers of the West, as well as sampling more pop culture. And by ranging much further formally, and you could look in the book and see Sun and Steel as a title, or the conclusion to Ode to Mr. Churchyard for just two examples. It also included poems of homonymic play, which is inspired by Claire de Plessis' example in Ecke. And what I particularly love about this book, kind of a theme running through all the books, is its intelligence. And in terms of Khashayar's work, its syncretism, its ability to be reflective about the self, it's meta-reflective about the cultures it inhabits, and it has a variety of affects, lust, love, anger, and sadness. But of course, last but not least, it's finesse with language. Whether it be the layered thoughts of Kramer's mind, etched as in per the orange pool noodles, when in doubt, carve your feelings into wood, or at the level of sound itself as per Tree Frog in the book. And the lines, cockroach-ridden shack whose seams crack and sullen rain dance screech, grief struck and stranded. Yeah. Please welcome Khashayar.
My tongue, twisting into my mother tongue, entwined. A new set of vowels for this chilly night of consonants, shrill with friction, like piss in toilet water. Past is lowly, a place of pasture. Past is a dialect I no longer speak fluently. And my present is hemorrhaging selves. My body, my tan, my epidermal self aching. I want to be on my knees hearing, shut up, socket. And I'll do both. Without moaning, the tongue can explore much, the tip disappearing. Male for man, male for tan, male to be male, the desire to arrive at the khod, become khoda. God in the flesh, self-aware. Self stands for self-enlightened life force. Above each self, an endless ladder of selves. Enter the tortoise with Achilles asymptotically approaching. Achilles, knock knock. Tortoise, kia. Achilles, man. Tortoise, man who? Achilles, the who man. One pillar of the threefold path, Zarathustra's Nietzsche traveling west come cover of dusk. And taking my eyes off the LED corona of texted nudes, my witching hour sunspots, supernova behind eyelids. The psychedelia of self-theft, self-loss, nebulous in its fragments, fragmented in its piercing light, oozing from eye sockets onto wrinkled foreheads. Mint in mortar. I stare into mirrors that refuse to reflect till medication can herd thoughts into pasture. Leash all that intrudes. Till I am my own mirror. Khoda. Self-reflective. Till I know clearly that I exist. Hello one, hello all. Thanks to friends, family, and everyone involved in this book. I'd rather speak less and read more. So this is a special, I know this is a book launch, but I'm gonna just do one small poem. It's because my dear friend and mentor, Roxanna Bennett, whom I'm launching this book with and whom has blurb this book, we had a correspondence over the last year, and I'm going to read a poem from our correspondence as respect and as. It's called Alaki. In Farsi, we call the spurious alaki, like the remainders of the sieve, sifted. But to be sifted is to be fiction, to be the poet's best line. A belly over spills, stretching underwear elastic, pastry untrimmed on the pie. Dear Kestrel, the rest is from the book. Dear Kestrel, fingers clawing your hair like I'm holding a Hamlet skull. I'm trying to remember you. Kez, don't you know I'm a solipsism sommelier, that I do Cartesian meditations before lunch? That I've got my 2 + 2 = 5 demon tatted on my shoulder. His thought bubble spelling your name. Holding you, I know your pen callus is the sexiest thing about you. We're too pumped full of GoPro visions of Zion to read, so we dine to soft erotica where cleavage is left uncleft. At Costco, you asked me to look at the books next to the crop tops, and I wondered if Moby Dick ever made it to a haberdashery or something. Dear Kestrel, holding you, I'm prosthetic. Holding you, I'm the loneliest me. I'll be in the frozen food aisle. Let's rendezvous on the other side. I have a whole bunch of film poems, and I'm going to read my favorite one, which happens to be the shortest one. After Tarkovsky's Mirror. Come throws of a cock, death throes of a bird, trapped in a fist. And the skin that sheathes our soul opaque. A dried leaf in the pages of history, blighted, once green. This one is called Pornhub Gay, and it's dedicated to Kirby. The bodies I attract, the bodies I'm attracted to, curves and sinews, muscle symmetry, epidermal glimmer. No body without warmth, no touch void of electricity. The most oppressed bodies are the most pornographically desired. The most oppressed bodies are the most pornographically endowed. The most suppressed desires of the most oppressed bodies. Desire, infinitely flexible, bending sex words, and the oppressed are the most lusciously bodied. Aggressively membered, then dismembered, disembodied, and remembered in taglines. An old limp dick hooded with smegma, liver spotted, sour stench, the kind that hits you like a fine wine, unfolds half-mast while cultures fuck each other into self-consuming wormholes. And I'm going to end with the final poem of the book, Circumnavigating Heaven in 3 Geographies. Parkdale. When B speaks of her drugs, I keep hearing heaven. I sip heaven from my pint of gin and speak etymologies. How in Farsi, heaven is simply behesht, akin to English best. How heaven is just us living our best lives. She cuts another line and walks back into the crowd, her dime bag of coke rolling onto wet asphalt. And I make a wish, crush it under my feet. Grandma's house. Grandma says pomegranates are heavenly, that each holds a seed directly from paradise. And she seeds painstakingly slow. Grandma's no storyteller. One seed rolls onto the carpet, blue paisley, red diamond. And I make a wish, crush it under my feet, and listen to the gentle static of car tires on wet asphalt, a motorway behind every window. Content warning, this next part has talk of suicide. Parkdale. B is gone. Days begin with silence. Everything in the house faces the lake where all the light seems to come from. The first ray of sunlight tells me I can't crawl back into the kitchen. So I coil myself around, stare at the television I can't turn on, crave a cigarette, stare at the lighter I can't reach, crave a drink, stare at the bottle I can't reach, and sit stewing in the soft whisper of car tires from somewhere behind everywhere I've lived as a child, redeeming everyone I've loved as a child. The buzzing silence, like all the afternoon naps I never took, and the 5-lane motorway with asphalt crackling, hidden from sight, but ever present, always heard from behind like the sour breath breathing dewdrops onto my shoulder blades. I walk onto the balcony where all the light seems to come from and stare down and into the lake and ache to descend into my best, into my heaven. Lakeshore for Kirby. My head weighing down my limp body, fingers searching body parts. I named them with eyes closed. Nose, cheek, lip. One by one, I earn body parts. Speak to some for the first time. Words embody and I listen, pen in hand, list myself limb from limb, leg, foot, gentle swell of breast larger than most. In winter, the hardest feat is to stand. A body limp from gravity. Hand, leg, mouth. Words are arbitrary, but we still use them wrong. It's dangerous when words stop at sharing. It's dangerous when words don't inform and my true form shaped by words, my true figure informed by shapes, my true shape figured out and figured in. Formed into a firm corpus where thoughts flow body in and life flows body out. Bodies elocute louder than words, and we never listen to limbs who break up, pursue solo careers and expression, while heads sit atop bodies limp and flaccid. If my skin lies about me, then what of the nights when all is sour but touch? It's dangerous when words stop at catharsis and I'm left bare on the bed, asking for a slap to heat up the skin so I can surface into my heaven. Thank you.
Thank you, Khashayar. Lovely. We'd love to have you again. We'll chat more about that. That was beautiful reading. Al Morris just gave you a thumbs up. That's a thumbs up from a legend. I'll give you a thumbs up later too when I figure out how to do that. Next, we have a pre-recording, but very lively pre-recording, and kind of a pre-recording that tests to our fidelity with, comfortableness with, and mandate pertaining to disability. So I'm going to introduce Roxanna. Roxanna, I should tell you what I'm up to, rather than, repeat award after award, which for Al would take me a long time. But rather than say how eminent people are in a kind of prize culture soundbite way, because I'm getting brought down a little bit by that lately, I figured I'd invest some work and say what I thought. So here we go. Roxanna is a poet that's been with Gordon Hill Press from the beginning, well, the beginning of us anyway, which is to say not for very long. She published Unmeaningable in her first series of books in the fall of 2019. That book did quite well for the press and for Roxanna and for itself. It won the Trillium Poetry Prize as well as the Souster Award. I have to say some things, Roxanna had been publishing before Luke, Vanessa, and I arrived on the scene, though, having released the Uncertainty Principle, her debut book with Tightrope in 2014. And what I love about Roxanna's work is its engagement with crypt poetics. She's read all the eminent American forerunners in the field, and she's played with their innovations and made them her own. There's also thematics of madness and engagement with that canon too, in really interesting ways, plus science fiction. It's really interesting. Yeah, what I loved most about Unmeaningable was its singular version of form. It was a crypt corona that undermined the rhythmic, sonic, and phrasal repetition that was demanded by that form. If you haven't read the book, I really encourage you to pick it up. Like Khashayar, Roxanna, for me, was a thinking disabled person's poet or something like that. It's not that we don't think, it's just especially thinky. That the work was heartbreaking to read was not an also or a plus, but it was intrinsic to her form. So the Untranslatable I builds on all the aforementioned elements by having Roxanna write and in new forms. But as a reader, what I particularly notice is she's increased the level of heartbreak here. It's gotten the level of difficulty has increased. The book's heartbreaking to read, which means, of course, that it's amongst my favorite things to read. Just listen to this little bit from CBT worksheet number 47, called Morning People. In Oshawa, I alienate old friends when I ask them to visit in the AM. We're not really morning people, they said. By noon, I'm numb, knocks cotton, need spoon feeding. By 3, can't speak. That was 4 years ago this spring. I haven't been social since then. When you don't feel connection, what then? Asked Dominic Parisian. Maybe what then is poetry about disconnection and disability. Please welcome Roxanna.
Thank you, Luke and Shane, and thank you, Dominic Parisian, and thank you, Kevin Hessel, for helping me record this reading. Thank you. Enjoy the reading. Oh, and thank you, Khashayar, for corresponding with me for the past year. Thank you. To be sifted is to be fiction. After Khashayar, I am Buddha, and so can you be a black-eyed Susan in a live stream zoo. Everything's connected in this beautiful world to the birds of prey. Scarab beetles, tray panning, the netherworld, fake cedar-stained deck whorls, 7 studs lined up in a row like a spine full of bolts. Habit merely march, inward violets. Across the street, windows, more daily unravels. The dog cries in its sleep. Who knows what brokenness crosses the cut? Oh, I know nothing. It is bright on either shore. The moon is cold, not what it was, thinned at high tide. Silent engines approaching, widening the light. Deep Carbon Observatory. The Deep Carbon Observatory. They're turning on the bandsaw because they know I want to read. They're turning on the bandsaw just for me. All anyone common is colors, shapes, sensation, the moon. All anyone is cups spilled, desert dunes. All anyone is bones, breath, blood want, hunger, regret our common ancestor. Tiny fossils found in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis, Hobbit's cousin. Did we dodo you too? The Deep Carbon Observatory dug up the earth and found it bigger on the inside. Life abounds, without sound, without sight, without water, air, or light. Not what we thought it meant to be alive, eating stones in the dark cold. But what do we know of the subtler orders and how to be unalone? Doing laundry in German. Can I be here? The Buddhist therapist says to stay present. In Berlin, I wish it was 1986. Nick Cave singing with Blixa under a bridge, but it's the season one of his twin sons slips from a cliff into the sea. My child is an ocean full fathom 5, and my bones made the pearls of their eyes. Hum lullabies far from home, twinned in mirrors dim from looking too long at the dodo's verdict. We follow Nick into the ocean when he sings, carried on a palanquin of our bodies. At the hospital, we listen to each other's music, taking turns learning what sounds save, learning how to hear another's pain in our own. Song is salve, vibrato asylum, elemental womb heart humming us home. The deep sound, I'm transforming, before hearing earless. I'm vibrating, look at me now, and after formless. At the screen on the green last week, I watched a parent's shock and grief spread across the screen. Across the sea from my kid, I believe I will not see again. Believe with the certainty of animal anxiety. I will die in a strange country. My body an international incident, tipped from air transat into ether, wrecks, terrorists, SARS, bullets, sadness. Before we left, I checked out evidence of bad mothering, vibrators, double-ended dildos, old lingerie, updated my last will and estimate of the debt my kid will be left with, a medic alert bracelet, and a geneticist banquet. On screen, the song falters, unresolved, dissolves like breath, sea foam, mermaid's curse. Strangers score our secret soundtracks. We track their passage, sunflowers shadowing distant suns, house band in the background in Wings of Desire, soundtrack for the housebound and undesirable. Desire is suffering, or a streetcar. And anyway, who needs to be held and forgiven? Nick sings on bodies electrified, desperate to transcend. I send my kid a postcard of Big Ben under construction. Skyline of crane silhouettes like giant alien overlords, bristling over brutalist condos, knockdown tenements knee-high to a Mothra. Is this jet lag or the Higgs boson blues? Couples trip over selfie sticks at the topography to terror, as oppressive as medicine basket body bags. On the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island, the Iroquoian-speaking Wendat, and the 1923 Williams Treaty's First Nations at the Station Gallery, I dose in genocide, having lied on my resume. Bonnie Devine's work dignifies what I can't describe. White, paper canoes suspended in still air. White, white, white body bags. Hanging rows of facts in lines to weave inside. Thank you for the medicine, the truth of objects, and for the life I live on this land. White canoe glides a ghost river. I am sorry for your suffering. May we be worthy of belonging. Checkpoint Charlie is a souvenir vendor selling sweat rags, sunscreen, plastic replicas of horror. I won't profane the Holocaust memorial with pics, but poems. Potsdamer Platz looks like Dundas Square, but we've yet to accept genocide's landmarks at home. Mourning feels performative. What can I know of your pain? I grew up not knowing I lived in Toronto. In the hospital, we sing, keep on pushing, push the sky away. I send my Prima postcard from the Champs-Élysées. Triple check my Lupron, Abilify, Wellbutrin, clonazepam, Seroquel, Navalone, lithium, Synthroid, the usual. Doing laundry in German upends the ritual rinse and repeat. Need to relearn the protocol of sock sorting, sharing machines. Lost cable leaves us hunting for dollar stores, but maybe they don't have China in Germany. We interrupt this memory with a memory of a memory, or is this a dream? I had a pub full of old friends, trivia, Heineken, who I was on which medication. No, I am not on vacation. Cripples a 247 vocation, round the clock operation, pain doesn't care. Whitby or London, Pickering or Berlin, winter, spring, your cousin's wedding, my own reading, pain is the sky, I keep on pushing, kid. Sisyphus got nothing on us. If I don't make it home, maybe you're better off.
I told you. I have no comment to improve upon that, so I'm going to introduce Concetta. Thank you, Roxanna, if you're hearing this. Concetta is well known as a poet and academic, but less well known, I think, as an essayist. Hopefully this book will change that. As a press, Gordon Hill is interested in poetry by poets who identify as disabled, sick, mad, and non-neurotypical. And it's my own, it's my own idiosyncrasy that I collapse those under the larger category or umbrella of disability, which is eminently debatable. But I'll just read that again. Disabled, sick, mad, and non-neurotypical. But we're also very much want nonfiction by and about these identities and themes. Stars Need Counting is a text that very clearly and beautifully articulates what it is or what it means to want to die via a number of lyric strategies. And I suppose, it might be a hard or a triggering book to read for some. But for me, it was as if I'm reading about a close friend, or it's a desire in me that's either pressing or faint, or it also could be like trying to reacquaint myself with just how potent the wish to die was once long ago, and will be, again in the future, will be, has been, and will be. So in short, it's comforting. And it achieves that comfort through its lyric beauty. So really, the preface alone, I think, should be required, let's say suggested, reading for anyone with innings spent in depression, either past, present, or future. So I recommend it very highly. But there's some other essays in the book that are just absolute knockouts, like Who Shot Meriwether Lewis and Political Suicide, a beautiful. The weird thing about this book, at least for me, it's haunted me. It's followed me around. And it's the essay Suicide is Out of the Question that's followed me around. Concetta uses the line, "Why are you never happy ever?" as a kind of lyric repetition strategy, a hook upon which to hang difficulty. It's a recurrent thing that she's heard, or at least the speaker in the essay has heard repeatedly throughout her life, especially uttered by family members. And there's a scene in it in which Concetta's mother relates decades later a version of what Concetta's childhood was from her perspective, from the mother's perspective. And I put myself in that moment, and I don't know if anyone out there with their innings in this sort of thing will do as well, but if you put yourself in that moment and you just wonder what your own parent might have said in a similar position, it's powerful. So please do pick up the book if you're intrigued. It's unique of its kind in Canada. If you've ever been there, you'll see yourself. If you ever wanted to better not understand what it's like for either you or someone else's benefit, then this book is also for you. Please welcome Concetta.
Thank you so much, Shane. I'm quite overwhelmed by how this book has moved you, and I think you've done the book, and I don't really need to do much here. So all I'm going to do is read from the preface, which is an invitation to you, everyone here, to read. And I also, before I read, I do want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you everyone for listening to me, because this is, this is the preface. It tells you, well, I'll start it, what you will not find in the pages ahead: a how-to book on committing suicide, an apology for suicide, the complete story of the mass suicide on Masada in 70 CE, and not just because it's news today that archaeologists, Jody Magnus, had found proof, or so she claims, to dispute the traditional understanding as affirmed by historian Flavius Josephus in his Jewish Wars, that the last standing renegade army of Jews died together as a mass suicide rather than be caught by the Romans and sent off to become slaves in the empire. The full story was in earlier drafts. Now you'll find the story in the pages ahead in its redacted form. Details of the mass suicides at Jonestown and Waco, Texas, or at least not many details. An apology for suicidal ideation. A righteous argument against suicide. A how to commit suicide in detail, in plan, in expectation, or even in the South Korean way, which is to buy yourself out of suicidal ideation. The short piece I wrote about South Korean doctors who, in efforts to address their distinction of having the highest number of suicides in the world, have developed a therapy that involves living out the fantasy of their funeral by giving people a chance to pick out a dress and the coffin they will lie in for the attendees of the make-believe funeral. A bizarre capitalist exploitation of the subject's desire to enjoy their symptom by spending their way through the jouissance of their post-life. All the pieces that did not make it past the edits for any of the following reasons or combination thereof: inappropriate, untrue, ill-conceived, triggering, boring, irrelevant, and long-winded, triggering, private. Any categorical claims, except for that one, of course. A comprehensive review of suicide. I figure the sociologists and doctors can keep that corner of the market. An existing market for which this was written. I swear I write what I am interested in reading and assume that, since I am of communities, there are some in those communities who want to read what I write, which means you don't exist yet as a market, since some editor is claiming, quote, "I'm not sure who would be interested in this," end quote. A suicide letter in any sense, in any context, as in not at all equal to Jean Emery's justification of his final passage à l'acte after writing on suicide. Judgment against Virginia Woolf's letter to her husband, quote, "If anybody could have saved me, it would have been you. Everything has gone from me but the certainty of your goodness. I can't go on spoiling your life any longer. I don't think two people could have been happier than we have been. V." End quote. A history of suicide. A definitive definition of suicide. A defense of suicide as a disease of the mind, especially since it is still not clear that suicide can be traced to any particular mental health condition, which means that its pathological markers remain ambiguous and in that sense not a disease per se. A defense of suicide bombers. A willful misunderstanding of suicide as sacrifice. An attention to the media rules around withholding information about suicide from the news, as outlined in this quotation from Ian Marsh's quote, "Suicide, Foucault, History and Truth." And the quotation is, "From the World Health Organization in a document titled Preventing Suicide, a resource for media professionals, in which we read," an internal quote, "suicide should not be depicted as a means of coping with personal problems such as bankruptcy, failure to pass an examination, or sexual abuse," end quote. End internal quote. By not mentioning these social material facts, the individual in the general public who is suffering these conditions and suicide ideation will not be encouraged to self-kill. On the other hand, internal quote, "any mental health problem the celebrity may have had should also be acknowledged." Internal end quote, end quote. The truth of suicide, though I would like to think that some truth about it is in the pages ahead. An affirmation of the media blackout of suicide as being productive, except to force people to resist their inclination to suicidal ideation, to give people reason to become terrified of this desire in themselves to self-harm, to the extent that often they act out self-harm in unconscious ways or even literally. When they are unconscious, as per Anna Mailer-Paperny's self-disclosure of her first suicide attempt in "Help, I Want to Die, Please Fix Me." About this, I have written elsewhere. A detailed consideration of Don Gilmore's work on his brother to the river, which I read and was compelled to share widely, except I was afraid to, because I couldn't figure out where you, my reader, were sitting. Afraid, as I have been hounded by media blackouts that to share could trigger others or could signal my interest in suicide as inappropriate. An indifference to the suffering of suicide survivors. A philosophy of suicide, as in Foucault, Socrates, any Roman on the nobility of suicide, Emery, Heidegger, Kant, even, though I consider suicide in philosophical terms. The box of suicide, as articulated in Antigone's predicament, which I see as 4 lines. The first being her love for her brother, connected to the line of her special relationship with the gods, that corners her in the imperative to bury her brother, which goes against Creon's corner on the civil laws, which he squares off by introducing the condition that Antigone sacrifice her life so that her brother can be buried. And despite the loss of the apparent joy of motherhood, she agrees to self-killing, thus sealing her square coffin, and she does so out of love for her brother. I deleted this version of Antigone many drafts ago and have never forgotten it, but cannot find a way to bring it into the pages ahead, so have set it up here as what will not appear again. A consideration of Hume's defense of suicide in Of Suicide. An in-depth consideration of Canada's First Nations children's suicide endemic, and not because it is irrelevant, because it is completely relevant to my project. And I have tried again and again to find a way to write it and put it in here, but I continually come up against the truth that it is not my story to tell. An argument for or against suicide. A flippant approach to medical assistance in dying. Extreme morbidity, though I will admit to some of it, since to erase all morbidity would be to whitewash the message in the suicidal act. Being flippant in reading the message of the suicidal act. My depression, since I work very hard to monitor its role in my language so that I am not spreading it around if I can help it, and I have brilliant editors to help me. Arrogance about what I think I know suicide is. Arrogance about my role as the gatekeeper here in this project, which is a strange position to have taken, which I did at a workshop when defining what it is I am doing with this project and my intentions. A bit of a confusing position since I am not a therapist. I am more Foucault in sympathizing with the desire for death, but also the desire to control how I die. But somehow I see myself as a gatekeeper. A clear and conscious definition of what I mean by being a gatekeeper in the story of suicide. A cynical view of suicide. All the stories I have been privy to during the writing of this project, which is an agreement for those of you who have shared yours with me, you know who you are. Know that I am thinking of you with all my heart, full of healing for you in your working through. A misplaced effort to support working through what suicide is. A trigger in the sense that here I am setting up the possibility that something here could be triggering for you, an author who sees and knows you, since I am not omniscient and respect your autonomy, an author who has not read widely. The call line for anyone who now or later while reading is compelled to seek help, which is why I'm putting the information here. Canada Suicide Prevention Services, www.crisisservicecanada.ca, 1-833-456-4566. And in Quebec, there's another number, 1-866-277-33553. Or text 45645 between 4 p.m. and 12 a.m. www.suicideprevention.ca. Judgment. An answer to why Sylvia Plath did what she did as the mother of 2 young children and with a new book coming out, Ariel titled, about to be released. Why she did what she did on February 11th, 1963. Since A. Alvarez is correct, suicide is a closed world and no answer can be had if we pursue the question, why? A response to suicide that is without love. Thank you.
Thank you, Concetta. Beautiful reading, and I'll include the remainder of the phone numbers and the websites when I'm done introducing Al in a moment. But just as with regards to that killer, that powerful last line, it's all too lacking, isn't it? It's all too lacking out there. It's a compassionate response. All right. Al's going to take us home. I'll introduce you, Al, don't worry. I was going to hand it over at that point. Seemed like it. This is something I've always wanted to do, to be honest. So, it's going to be the one time in my life that I get to do it. And I'm okay with screwing it up. So there's no stakes. You'll see what I'm doing as I go. I first corresponded with Al in 2003. I don't know if he remembers. He probably does. When I was interviewing him for Books in Canada. He was kind and generous back then. He was a very prestigious poet, but pre-national, international awards from everywhere. But those are 2 qualities that are quite familiar in Al discourse, hearing about his kindness and his generosity. And what I remember most vividly, though, which probably is of no relevance whatsoever, but I'm just making confessions, is that his first email came to me on a work computer in the St. John Regional Hospital in the emergency department. I don't know why that's important, but it was like my first contact. It was the very first time I heard from Al was an email. I looked up in there on a computer, the nursing station, and I don't know why, but that experience just really is powerful in my mind. That's one of the greatest poets I could be reading who's alive just sent me an email. Maybe that's it. I don't know, but I'll never lose that image. So skip forward 17 years or so, and after I don't know how many encounters at readings and lunches, that sort of thing, what I've noticed about Al has remained to be simple. He goes to a lot of readings, and he goes to them what I would call non-strategically, you know. I mean, I'm sure some of it is, but he goes to readings for poets that will never do him a favor, I don't think. And he's going simply because he's friends with these poets. And I've been watching this for long enough to know that it's true. One time I asked him about a group of open mic poets he seemed to know very well, but whom I didn't know at all. He said, you know, I came because they're my friends. I've also chatted with Al a fair amount at readings, and I've come to taxonomize the kind of poets that approach him. And my approach, unlike now, in which I'm completely going the opposite way on purpose, is to sit back and listen to Al's stories, not because he's a notorious talker or supremely gregarious. I just want to listen to Al speak about poetry, period. It's fascinating to hear. Many of the people who are in his orbit want to impose themselves on him, and many want to talk as much as him or to regale him with their writing and accomplishments. And I've always found that weird, but thinking of Al for a bit, I guess it'd be boring to have to talk all the time, and it'd be treated if one was capital G great, right? So I never thought it'd be my honor to ever publish a book by Al Moritz. Al publishes with a Nancy, as you all know, and they declined to publish this book. But I very much lobbied Al to publish it because of the majesty, as you know, of his previous work, but also more so because this book struck me as too important to pass up, too important to pass up. This book strikes me as meant to be as an object, as a construct, as imaginarium, as poetic testimony. It strikes me as his most urgent work since Night Street Repairs, and you could say he's hardly been slacking since then, but me. And I want to mention my disabled self circa 2004, when I read Night Street Repairs obsessively while I took care of my 3-year-old daughter for an entire year when I was unable to work as a physician. I remember reading Al back then and going outside to play in the snow with my daughter, and then we'd come back inside, warm up, and I'd repeat the process. So anyway, The Garden is one poet's serious engagement with racism and state violence over the course of decades. It asks, what is poetry for in the face of injustice? And it's careful about its subject position in the course of asking. The Garden is a book for which great pains were taken to render its lines sensitively, with feedback sought, acknowledged, and incorporated in order to have greater fidelity to poetic truth. Please welcome Al Moritz.
Thanks a lot, Shane. A wonderful introduction because of its personal reminiscences, and it's going back over about 30 years of our association, and remembering things like poetry readings and so on, which are our world. And I like the portrayal of me. I didn't see myself on a movie going in and standing in the back of a poetry reading and having the joy of knowing many of the people. And then, of course, meeting other people there. I think of people that I encountered this way. And it's my first knowledge of people who became good friends. So I'll give a famous example, Sue Tamavongsa, for instance. I went to a poetry reading, and there she was as still a U of T undergrad reading a few poems, and I thought, oh, these are great. And I went up and said hi to her afterwards, and we've been pals ever since. So there's many stories like that that I could tell about the beauty of just attending poetry readings. You know, Toronto has been one of the most lively cities in the world from that point of view for some years now. And it's not very much a story that is told. If there were still, you know, newspapers that people read much anymore, and somebody could constitute himself an arts journalist of literary quality who paid attention to the poetry scene, he would have an awfully vivid a story to tell, filled with wonderful characters, happiness and tragedy, accomplishment and frustration over the years, the opening and closing of venues, a whole ghost world, as it were, that exists amongst us, and in many ways is more real than the supposedly real world. So I liked hearing that introduction, a unique form of introduction. Well, for my book, The Garden, Shane has described it well, and so I'm just going to read a bit of it. So I'll just sort of say about its layout. It's called The Garden, a Poem and an Essay. To my mind, the essay is really just part of the poem, but you know, since it's in prose, it does have a special kind of valence to it, its own particular intention. The poem comes first, and the poem is entitled The Garden in the Midst, Los Angeles, 29 April to 5 May, 1992. In other words, its central subject is the South Central Los Angeles so-called riots in response to the non-guilty verdict of the policeman who had been seen badly beating Rodney King about 1 year earlier in March of 1991. So that's the basic, that's the central provocation, let's say, of the poem and the essay. I wrote them in 1992, but never published them. Under the stimulus of the events of last summer, the killing of George Floyd, I went back to this book and I liked it. So I decided to revive it. And I decided to somewhat reposition it to emphasize its kinship with what had happened now almost 40 years or 30 years later. And also with a subject that it had in 1992, how that event was similar to the things that we were fighting in 1968 at the time of the murder of Dr. King. And when that was those were the years 65 to 69 when I was an undergrad student and a bit of an activist and so forth. So, so I added some to this book with the help of some very good guides, like for instance, Shane, but like for instance, Ian Wilson, Andre Alexis, George Eliot Clark, and others. So they helped me very much in going over it. And so that's the poem. It's a long poem, so about 70 pages or something like that. And then the essay is sort of about similar extension, and it is called The Poet's Garden. So the link between these two is, you know, clear throughout if you read both of them. But The Garden in the Midst, Los Angeles, 29 April to 5 May 1992, has a little epigraph, not from somebody else, written by yours truly, and my own little aphorism. The poet's garden is the people. So that when you come to the essay called The Poet's Garden, then you know what I'm talking about. The flowers are the people. And when I talk so prominently about the garden and the marigold in the poem, it connects to the idea that what I'm really talking about is the people that is made clearer, maybe in a sense, in the essay. So what I'm going to do is read the first part of the poem, which is just 6 short pages. It's like, that sounds like a lot, but it's like 6 short poems, sort of. And then I'll read 1 page and then 2 other short paragraphs from the essay to give a little taste of that. So this is the first part of the poem, and it is entitled 3 Kings, 1992, 1968, 2020. The television played the beating of a king again and again, never-ending beating just to inform us now in 1992, 24 years after the murder of our great king. Now it's another Rodney King, construction worker, poor with his police record put against him with the leather and sticks of the police in the video of his arrest a year ago. The strikes to his face are brought back again, informing us over and over, the images replayed, remade on television now, that it was news again, not fade away history any longer. Now the police had been set free again. The jury in suburban Simi Valley just has found them not guilty of what we could see, we had to see. And Rodney stayed being beaten on television for being black, in black and white video that clarifies his troubles, being beaten on television for having little but troubles, that crime. And Dr. King had been dispatched, shot away 1968 by the nation of moonshots and citizen snipers, shot safely, they thought, to eternity for the sin of wishing them well. So they were left, the unworthy, the failed regents of justice here, of that banished poetry. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? When they nailed him to a tree? Yes, you were there, but now again in 2020. Were you there when they crucified George Floyd? You were there when they nailed him with a knee into the concrete. Lord, don't let it be that you're being lynched on a tree ever and again as on a loop in hell, a video we repeat of a being beaten. Oh, don't let it be the image of what we are, of what we always must do, but establish the justice, the poetry that you were and are to be, the poetry today that we kill you for. So that's the first introductory section of the poem. And now I'm going to read a couple of short passages from the essay, which I've chosen because they say pretty, I don't know, in a pretty downright way, sort of what the basic encompassing subject of the book is. In our day, technology, science, rationalized discourse of all types, and mass communications have minimized, often actively intending and seeking to do so, the relevance and credibility of poetry. The street poets, so I'm talking about a poem that was written at the time of the 1992 riot. The street poet's poem makes us see that we will never understand the people who provoked the riot, police and jurors and their encouragers. And we will never understand the people who participated in it and suffered from it, the inhabitants of South Central Los Angeles, unless we listen to them in a certain way, a poetic way, attention to the whole reality. But this truth is occluded by police barricades, gated communities, segregated zip codes, massive imbalance of wealth and power. It can come only from an attention to and grasp of the whole that is beyond all possible analysis, all technology, science, logical discourse of any type, and mass communications. These things can at best be aids to and tools of poetry. The street poet's poem was simply participating in the nature of poetry. Its nature is always to involve life's contradictions and the way they are necessary to one another, but are surpassed in a mutual unity that comes partly from the pure act of living and partly from the intentional exercise of artistic creativity. Those who today happily and even proudly ignore poetry ignore the place where they would meet the full complexity and completeness of human being. What they are ignoring is the richness of life. They are self-protectively ignoring also the pain of realizing that their disasters come largely from the fact that life does not open to the methods they have committed themselves to. Let's say it more bluntly, limited themselves to. Of course, the fullness of life belongs first of all to life itself. And all the scorners of poetry naturally pat themselves on the back if they ever think of the issue for being human, for having a soul just as well as the next guy. In other words, they think that they inherently have sufficient poetry. Well, the human being also inherently has chemistry. That does not mean that one can know anything about it and do much with it without chemists and the whole science of chemistry. In the same way, we delude ourselves if we think we have any access to our soul and any chance and means to develop our soul, any chance or means to be human without poetry. And then I'll read the last couple of very short stanzas in a later section of the essay. Reason, a general culture, an intellectual procedure which always keeps first and foremost the view of the whole and the supreme reality and dignity of each individual person and thing. This is the source of the truly new from the standpoint of our present methods and behaviors. And since we ought to have a brief, convenient, and meaningful term to call it by, we might call it poetry. It would be right to name that which should govern our actions after its chief exemplar in human culture. Okay, so that's a little taste of my book. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Al. Oh, let me introduce you, Luke.
All right.
It's embarrassment time. Thank you very much, Al. I encourage everyone to read that, and it's an honor. It's an honor to have you here. Hope it felt good.
Thank you, Shane. It's been wonderful. I'm just sort of overexcited by, I'm always sweaty palmed when I read anything by myself. So sweaty armpitted, I should say.
It's reassuring to know that happens to you. We'll get into that maybe in the questions. We'll talk about that. But that's not my job. I just wanted to say real briefly, because I'm ashamed to acknowledge this. I didn't introduce Luke, who probably will do a better job introducing himself maybe. I just wanted to praise him for the gorgeous books that you've seen him design. I really am completely thrilled with the way the books are looking, and that's all him in concert with our authors. So stuff looks great. Okay, Shane out, and over to Luke.
Thank you, Shane. I'm Jeremy Luke Hill. I'm the publisher of Gordon Hill Press. For those of you who are blind or visually impaired, I am a middle-aged white guy with a beard and glasses, and right behind me is a bunch of stuff that I've collected over the years pasted on my walls. So think eclectic, vaguely literary things, and you'll have an idea of what we're looking at here. I just want to say how much I appreciate all the readings we had today. It's a really a wonderful experience to hear people reading from things that you've spent so much time on a visual level. Then you get to see how they interpret that. It's always a really unique and interesting experience. So I'm going to be doing a little bit of Q&A today. If you have a question for the authors, feel free to send that to me directly, or you can also send that to Vanessa and she'll send it to me, I'm sure. And if you send that on, I will make sure to ask. I'm going to start with Kramer, going way back, but I wanted to touch on something that you had said there about the exchange that you had with Roxanna. And she also read a poem from that exchange. And since she can't be here, I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the experience of that interaction and how that's played its way out in your own writing, how that's helped you develop and that relationship. And
let me see. Yes, I am unmuted. So yeah, I guess as a way to quench pandemic anxiety, both for me and Roxanna, we began our poetic correspondence. And what's funny is that we didn't plan which poems to read. I planned my poem and she planned her poem separately, but we ended up planning the same call and response. So she actually ended up reading the exact poem that was in response to the small poem that I read. Anyway, sorry. Well, I guess like one thing that it's not just us, but it's been like there's been an amazing wealth of collaborative work coming specifically out of the pandemic. I don't know if it is like about, again, like artists having I'm not saying more time to spare, but more time at home, basically. I don't know exactly what factors have made this happen, but I have never seen this much collaborative poetry or collaborative literary and artistic work in my short life in the arts, and it's a huge surge, definitely. But yeah, I guess I won't go too much about that. But yeah, we send poems back and forth from basically the first few weeks of the pandemic, and it's still ongoing.
have you found that that's changed your writing at all? That that experience of exchanging poems like that?
I not really. Like I have very different types of projects, and every project I work very differently. So I guess it's yeah, yes and no. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Yep. Concetta, I want to talk to you about the essay form for you, as opposed to other kinds of forms that that I was familiar with you writing. How does that form differ for you? The process of it. What does it allow you to do that that you wouldn't be able to do through poetry or through more academic writing?
Yeah, you know what was very interesting about this project was that it started off way more lyrical, and in fact, it did start off as some prose poetry, but then in the process of exploring something that I knew a lot about, with respect to some philosophy and historical material, and in my academic work. So I have written a bit about suicide in my the periods during which suicide was sort of central. Yeah, so that academic material started kind of coming in as a layer that wanted to be needed more prosaic work. Basically, it just the thing is, I probably my poetry is like it just these things fold into it. And this project could not have been a poetry project. There was too much I wanted to think through and feel through, and then as I started working on it, I realized there's a lot. There are so many stories as well, and so many different ways of thinking about suicide. Like one of the short, I've got a number of case studies, small prose pieces, And one of those prose pieces just happened when I was thinking about suicide in literature, and the fact that my son in grade 9 was reading Romeo and Juliet. And so I asked him, well, what did you think of the suicide at the end? And he said, well, what suicide? And then I realized, that's right. I did it in grade 9. I think everybody has done Romeo and Juliet, and no teachers coming at you saying, you know what, you are a teenager and you shouldn't be involved. You shouldn't go where Romeo and Juliet went, but it's not treated that way, right? So it's that kind of, these elements, these sort of small narrative, small thinking pieces that, asked for prosaic work. Yeah.
Thank you. Al, one of the things that really struck me about the process of your book is you mentioned that you first wrote it like in 1992 and then sort of revived it recently, which is, I don't know if that's a record for you. I don't know if you have books that have taken that long to write in the past, but that's quite a period of time to come back to a book. I wondered what that process was like for you, or that experience was like for you to come back to a manuscript after that kind of time. How did it appear to you when you returned to it? What kinds of things did you feel like needed to be done to it in order to make it relevant still? So I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. Well, in 1992, it was already a revival of things that, because of the necessities of life, had gone to sleep in me for a while. I mean, I was first interested in social justice back when I was maybe about 10 or 11 at the time of President Eisenhower sending the American troops to Arkansas to enforce the Supreme Court order to integrate Little Rock Central High School. And so I was interested in that ever since then, and I soon found out that my parents, both teachers, were, insofar as was possible within the culture of that time, defenders and promoters of Black students and teachers in the local school system and so on. So that evolved into the activism of the 1960s and so forth. And of course, all the crushing things like, the earlier assassination of Medgar Evers, and then the assassination of Dr. King, who was such a hero to everybody, and so forth. So, I wrote about this peripherally. I tried to do several things that just did not work. Like, for instance, at the time of the Soweto uprisings in South Africa, I was reading a long poem, and I couldn't write it. It didn't work. And, time passed by the time I got anywhere with it. And I didn't like it. So I just feel like when 1992 came, that event galvanized me to write. And I was able to write something that really in poetry I'd only referred to. So already in 1992, just as that preface says, I'm looking back 24 years and more and catching up that time. But for various reasons, I couldn't try to publish the book at that time. When George Floyd event came last summer, I was really moved to try to write something. And I remembered this, and I thought I had been very excited by it when I wrote it. I will get it out and look at it. And I found it good, and I was almost surprised by the poem, and especially the essay section, in the sense that it already expressed things about sort of my basic vision of poetry. Let's put it this way: poetry and justice are convertible terms. This is a basic point of my vision of things. And of course, when we say poetry in that sense, we're not talking about just the art of poetry. And yet, the art of poetry, as words in lines, has an essential, irreplaceable role at the center of poetry in the larger sense, and thus at the center of justice. So I felt that, you know, this was a chance to galvanize myself, to get this polished, get it relevant to today insofar as I could, and finally enter, you know, as a poet, say it more clearly than I had generally done in my work up to this point. So it kind of catches up these various points in a life. I think something that occurs to me is that Khashayar talked about how there's been more collaboration in the COVID period than he ever mentioned before. Well, a big example of that is the great concentration here and all around the world on the police murder of George Floyd. People were able to pay attention to that and go out and protest because they weren't at work. Because they were caught up in the pandemic. So what does that mean? It means a natural incursion, which we think of as only evil, interfered with one of the main means of repression and injustice that we all always find. The system adjusts to absolutely preoccupy us and make us spend all our good time making a living, conforming to the technical requirements of behavior and positioning to make a living, associating with the people who may be wonderful and you might find friends among them, but associating with the people you have to because of making a living, and thus having very little time for other types of association and so forth. And as a result, things like these protests and any kind of revolution are repressed, even more so than by propaganda, just by the propaganda of the physical necessities of the technological economic system. And I put technological first. Technological is very much more important than economic, political, and so forth. So I was sitting there experiencing this, and I thought how my poem is not only about social justice, but it's about the role in the modern world of technology and the technological attitude as the chief evil underlying social justice, injustice, and many other things. And I thought I wanted to say something about this, and lo and behold, I had already said it 30 years ago in this essay. So I would just try to improve this essay and update it and see if I couldn't release it. And thanks to almost the cooperation between Nancy, which would never have been able to get it out in time and acknowledge that, allowing me to go to Gordon Hill and through Shane, I'm just so grateful to everybody on both sides of that. I was able to get it out quickly within the limits of book publishing, right? But it's a good thing I had to spend a year on it because my helpers added so much to the properness of its nuance and its understanding of justice from the standpoint of the people who really suffer it.
Thanks so much. Creamer, I want to tag in a little bit with what Al was saying about how the collaboration there is, in a sense, it comes out of that you're being forced into it in a sense to deal with the pandemic, but it produces this thing that sometimes gives us more space to do what we otherwise wouldn't. I'm wondering also if there's a similarity there with the other projects that you're working on, the collaborative projects with the translations, because I know you've been doing a bunch of translation and you'd like to do some more. Whether those kinds of opportunities are also, what role that plays in your work and the influence that translation plays on your own work.
Yeah. Well, sorry, I have a mute button on my mic and one on the thing. I keep forgetting which one's muted and which one's not. So yeah, like I think language and like specifically being like familiar with different languages and having lived in different parts of the world, like having lived in like 3 separate continents in the past like 15 years of my life. Sorry, 2 separate continents. It's just like way West Asia and then way East of Asia. Anyway, being familiar with like I think, read, write in different languages, and for me, I guess like I forgot if this part was mentioned live or this was in our green room, but when Moritz was talking about reading Octavio Paz almost every day, well, like a lot of writers, well, you know, there's always binging and then purging and binging and then purging, and there are times where you need to absorb, and a great way of absorbing is because translation is both binging and purging at the same time, where you are creative, you're being creative, but in a very well-defined space, as in you have creative freedom, but in a very, it's not like a poem where you sit down and you're like, what should I write about? It's an absolute, it's a almost aggressively overbearing feeling of freedom. But when you have a poem already written that you want to render into another language, you have all the creative freedom to do it in a way that you want, but you also have the responsibility to the original, which it's always a great way of moving your work forward when you are it's a great, I'm talking this in a way of how this translation work works in relation to your own poetry in later, because you learn certain things in translation and that you don't by being way too open with your own work, because it's it's always like there's, I think with every art form, the most you will learn is always under the most you will learn and the most you will hone your skills is always under certain parameters and certain limitations, and translation is a great path to limiting yourself in a way that you can later be more creative when you have space for your own work. And this is me talking about like translation and what it does to your work later, as opposed to like what it means for the translation itself, because you asked it in relationship to my own work. But yeah, I did a lot of yes. I forgot. I think I addressed everything. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So we're kind of running out of time here. I want to have a chance for people to actually respond and chat a little bit to afterwards. You want to have you turn your mics and chat to the authors yourself. We had I have a whole list of things I want you to ask the authors here. Maybe I'll kind of put that on at myself when I get a chance. But I wanted to thank everybody for coming today. It's really been a really positive experience for me to interact with a lot of these authors that I don't stuck in my house here. I don't get a chance to get out and meet people, but so it's great to kind of see at least your faces across the screen and to be able to engage with you that way. And I'm looking forward to a chance in the fall for us to do real launches again. And our hope is that we'll be able to kind of get some of the authors who launched this spring to participate in those also. So you get a chance to see people in real life and get them to sign your books and do all of that kind of stuff. As we finish here, I just want to remind you that you can grab all of those books on the website there. Vanessa's been throwing those links up in the chat. And if you want to be in touch with us about that, you can certainly do that. We're more than happy to send you copies. And I wanted to thank all the people who participated in helping out to make this happen today. The authors themselves, Shane for doing the introductions, and Vanessa for running things behind the scene, Kirby and Knife Fork Book for helping us do the promotion and being involved with this. We're really blessed to have a community of people who are promoting these things. And like Al was saying, the participating in those things, I think you call it a ghost world or a shadow world, but when you're in it and you're participating in it, it feels a lot more real than the real world sometimes. And that's what I appreciate today very much. Vanessa, you want to take us away?
Yes, hello. It's hard to spotlight myself. Hello. That was really wonderful. I also just want to say thank you to everyone who read today. Shane for the lovely introductions. I have posted the link in the chat. Thank you to Kirby for the partnership. The readings were really beautiful today, and yeah, very excited for the fall launch, which will be the next event that we'll be hosting.